Just before I introduce Carly, I just want to say a couple of words for Mum and Dad. Often amongst the chaos of grief, the siblings are sometimes the forgotten grievers, grieving differently to Mum and Dad. I know for Judy and myself, after the death of our son Nick, our concerns for Carly and Josh, who were 16 and 15 at that time, was paramount to us. In fact, Judy and myself made a pact between the two of us to put our lives on hold, to do whatever we could to help them start this journey, and also to help them move on with their lives and respectfully take the loss of their brother with them. A real positive from this journey is to now see Carly and Josh moving on with their lives. They have worked ever so hard. Carly is now a registered psychologist after all her years of study, and our son Josh, a licensed builder. And that's all happened before he turns 25. And all of this happening amongst the reorientation of our family. It makes Judy and myself especially proud today for what I think is the first presidential weekend, and that is to introduce our daughter Carly, who will inform us as parents to what it was like to be a sibling after losing her brother Nick.
You nearly got me that time, but you did. I was incredibly unsure where to start or where to go with this presentation. Can everyone hear me up the back? Yeah. I guess there's a few things that I wanted to start with from the presentation this morning by Mel and Di. Before I do that, I just wanted to let you know that Tony in the corner here is going to be recording this more for my development and my journey, which I'll talk a little bit about down the track in terms of some of the things that I do to make sense of it. But he's not going to be filming anyone and any reactions at all, so I just wanted to clarify that for you. A few things which you may have seen quite evident this morning when I read the Credo. We live after we've lost someone similar to what we did before. Well, I was the kid that cried when I missed the bus, so I cry all the time. I was the kid that got really upset when someone was quite nasty at school. I would cry. I wouldn't punch. I wouldn't retract from it. I would just cry. So I have found that has been a really important part for me in this journey, is the tears are okay, and I actually think they're good for the soul. So I try not to make apologies for it. I'm similar to Mel and Di in a way that this weekend for me was quite tricky when I started thinking about it, because in my private practice and my clinical work, I quite tactfully and as best as I can leave Nick outside to go and do what he does and put my psychologist hat on and really sit with people, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation as well. But this weekend's a little bit unique, so when the tears are there, it's because I've allowed, in a very similar fashion, Nick to be here with me. I'm sure he's going to flick a few pages through for me or do something strange, so if I do anything embarrassing, I'll just blame it on him. Before I get started, I just was wondering if, for a bit of a show of hands, how many of the bereaved parents or siblings in the room have got children that are still here with us? Okay, good. I'm going to talk a little bit from two perspectives, so both professionally but predominantly personally, my journey as a sibling, the good, the bad and the ugly, as I mentioned in the brief. And as I said, I have no idea where to start. I was quite refreshed to hear Mel and I discuss the fact that there are no stages, because in my professional training I've been to many events where they start to talk about the process of grief, and we start at denial and we go to anger, and I'm sitting in the crowd thinking, seriously, I just want to get up and leave right now. So I think from a professional perspective, there are certain things that our profession do that don't apply to grief and bereavement in any way, shape or form. We can't put a model around it, and I was only saying to Dad last night, and I often say to my clients, if there was a manual, it would make it easy, but there's never going to be one, because you would need a manual for each minute of each day, of each hour, for about 100 years for it to give us any advice or guidance. So these are the types of things I was thinking about in coming up with this presentation. So I guess with where we go to from here, what I will, and I'll just make sure this is going to work. Where to start? I never with my clients, nor will I here today, pretend to know what it's like or even want to know what it's like to be a bereaved parent. I don't. I'm going to share my experience of being a bereaved sibling, which I think is very different. I will share my story as openly and candidly as I can. I will probably cry, even as a psychologist and knowing lots of those techniques to be able to manage it, it's still there. I will not talk as though it is fact, because what I say is not fact. It's based on experience and also my personal experience, my frame of reference. When I put this slide together, the page underneath it was blank because I didn't know what to say. So I'm not going to talk about the day that we lost Nick. I'm going to talk about what followed, because I think that's where the journey is really important, and that's where the story is. I work a lot now in a space with trauma, and I do believe that this slide represents that for me. And I also work in a space in the grief and bereavement counselling space, and I think they're very different for different reasons, and I want to keep a focus on what the purpose of this weekend is. So, the chaos from the 28th of December and what followed. So, some of the reactions for me, and some were similar for my brother, some were dissimilar. So, it should have been me. If anyone asked me what was it that you first thought was it should have been me, then it was, I wonder if it was me. Would this many people have turned up? Would Mum and Dad be this sad if it was me? Sorry, I'm trying not to look at my mum right now.
We're trying not to look at you. Fail.
Epic fail. So it was a lot about it should have been me, trying to really intellectualise what had happened. What about me? And I guess this came immediately, but also in the weeks and months that followed, which was an important part of that journey, is a lot of those reflections about, well, how does the world work if you lose your brother when you're 16 years old? There's a lot of uncertainty, and they are questions, but it feels like chaos. And I think they're one in two. Is, what if Mum didn't pick me up from Macca's that day at work, and I didn't ask her to drive me to a friend's house to pick up a strapless bra for a party that I was going to that night? What if that didn't happen? Maybe Nick would have jumped out of the pool and come to tell me about his morning. So some of the guilt that Mel and I alluded to today was certainly evident in that process. The what ifs and the what ifs are still there to an extent, but it's getting used to the fact that they're always going to be there. I guess what the hell is going on? And that was something that lasted in that journey for quite some time, is the brain's way of trying to make sense of something that you just can't make sense of. And I use the analogy of the puzzle when I was thinking through this, and I use it with my clients as well, is when Nick died, someone came along and picked the puzzle up and threw it so high in the air that the pieces ended up in Canada and Alaska and all of these places, and it really has taken a lot of time to be able to even get the outside picture of the puzzle back together, much less where the pieces go in the middle. So I'll keep alluding back to that. I will talk a little bit about the different roles that siblings may go through in that process, and making sense of those first few days and weeks and months. But basically, much to mine and my brother's disgust, Mum and Dad sent us back to school in January or February, 1st of February. Nick had died on the 28th of December, and school went back. I was going into Year 12 to do my HSC. I believe, looking back, it was absolutely the right decision to make. I don't know whether there is a right or wrong one, but for us it worked. There were days when I sat in the toilets and howled at school. But that was an important part of reintegrating very slowly. There was days when I'd come home and I would look at Mum and Dad and say, I can't go back. Done, I'm out. And the next day you'd wake up and you feel a little bit different, so you go. And I guess this process taught myself, and I know my brother, that making those decisions in the moment are unhelpful because you never know how you're going to feel in the next moment. And I'll come back to that a little bit as we move through. So basically those questions I feel for siblings are absolutely there. But also the questions around, would it be the same if it was me? Would Mum and Dad be this sad? And you actually genuinely question that. I don't question that from a perspective of thinking that Mum and Dad love Nick more than they loved Josh and I, but it certainly feels evident in those days that follow when everyone is there to see your Mum and Dad and talk about Nick, and you're sort of in the shadows at times, and that is definitely not intentional. That, I think, is something that I've realised is unintentional for people, is the focus is Mum and Dad, and that's okay. Making sense of the chaos. From a practitioner perspective, and since I've done a lot of reading, I have realised and reflected on my own journey quite a lot, and I've realised that defence mechanism in kids of the brain just not letting the pain in is actually there for a reason. It's too hard. I think the technical term is the psychological buffer, which protects knowledge and awareness of feelings that you're not ready to deal with from getting in. Basically, it means it's the too hard basket, and I'm just going to leave it there for quite some time. And despite some of the intensity of the feelings that I believe I felt in that first 3 to 5 days, I think it then went numb and black, and there wasn't anything for a long time for a reason, because it was too hard. So the distractions worked, the listening to Mum and Dad. It felt like for a period of time I was actually helping Mum and Dad through this rather than having it yourself. And I think that served a very positive purpose for a child, is it actually helps kids to start to come to terms with that at a different pace. And I talk a lot to the bereaved parents that I work with now about, that's okay. It's not that they're not coping because they're not talking about it, it's where they're at on the journey. And then it is that protective function. If they laugh, I'll think I'm better. This I know because I've talked to Mum and Dad about it, and I hear it from a lot of the clients that I work with, is, Carly, I can't laugh or they'll think I'm better. If I cry, they think I'm worse. We have this external validation of where we're at, or this external process of everyone watching us, and the sense of being different. And I absolutely felt that as a sibling, particularly going back to school, was, you know what, the colour of your hair and the streaks you get is really not that relevant for me right now. And I think for siblings, it's quite difficult to go back into an environment that barely changes. So kids don't even skirt around the issues. They'll just say it or ignore it. So it's not even that they'll cross the road to avoid you, it's that they'll walk straight up to you and say something highly inappropriate without even thinking about it. And that's okay, because that's part of the process, and that's what I've learned, is that's okay. In the moment, I was nowhere near as diplomatic. I used to get incredibly upset, incredibly frustrated. I would come home and I would swear and scream and cry to mum saying no one understands. And they didn't, and they weren't supposed to. And I guess that's what hindsight gave me is that ability to think, yeah, I don't want them to understand actually, because I don't want them to feel this. As much as I don't like them, I don't want them to understand what this feels like. I want them to understand what I'm going through, but I don't want them to understand what this feels like. And I guess I keep referring back to then and now, and I don't quite know if there was any moment where I started reflecting on it in a different way, but it's just that journey and where the path is at the minute for me. And I will cover that shortly. For me, there were a lot of dark days that followed sometime later, and I call this the Academy Award-winning performance. I think bereaved parents would be the best trained actors and actresses ever. I'm fine, things are great, mum and dad are doing well, I'm great, you know, netball's going really good, did really well in my HSC, I'm off to Canberra to do uni, the world's a good place. Not only was I lying to myself, I actually believed that for a period as a child and as a teenager. And really crashed and burned. That I see as a really, really important part of my journey, because it's not what I learned from losing Nick, it's what I learned from crashing and burning. And I've spoken to quite a few siblings socially or in my work, but more socially, that is quite common, is things are great, you get things back on track, life's good, mum and dad are going well, bang, the wheels fall off. And the puzzle gets thrown back in the air and all the pieces that you thought you started to have in place are just not where you thought they were. And I think it's living through that darkness that helps you to come out the other side as well. I know personally it was for me. The point where I thought, okay, I was being, and I'll talk about this in my next slide, I was being sister to Josh, support to mum, support to dad, trying to work out who I was, being a student, being a social butterfly. But in all that, it was sufficient enough distraction to stay completely away from what I wanted to feel, and that taught to really open up and feel what you need to feel. And I guess that's where I don't think any sibling's journey is ever similar or identical, as parents aren't. That was my journey at that point, was when it really came to life for me, and that was about 4 years after Nick died. Some of the pronounced things at this point, around the first 5 years, the one thing that drove me absolutely mad as a sibling, walked down the street, hey Carly, how's your mum and dad? Great, how do you think I'm going? You would go to school and the teachers would say, hey Carly, how's your mum and dad tracking along? Good. Carly, how's your mum and dad? How's your auntie and uncle? How's your mum and dad? It's all we found we were hearing, and again, I don't believe that was intentional, it was coming from a good place, but it felt horrible, is the very few people that said, how are you? In some sort of way, I guess it taught you the intensity of what your parents were going through, and that's been an important part of this journey too. But it's quite pronounced in terms of the things that I remember from that period. Hey, how's your mum and dad? I did in my head formulate quite a few creative responses, which I didn't ever give, but I think that was an important part as well. And I was talking to a client a few weeks ago about, Carly, I think that you should talk to this conference about having the answers to the questions that you don't see coming up. So you meet with the tax man. So how many dependents do you have? How many brothers and sisters do you have? We don't learn to answer those questions, and I guess it's the same for siblings at school and when you're down the street, is we don't have a script to answer those questions, and that makes it really difficult. A few other points before I move forward. Josh, my brother, so I was the crier, quite clearly. I remember one night my brother and I had been out and we'd had a suitable amount of beverages. And we got home and we woke Mum and Dad up, as we do. You should have seen what this person was wearing and what we were doing, etc., etc. From somewhere in the midst of darkness, my brother, who internalised a lot, was always there to sit with us, etc., but never said much, went completely and utterly psycho. So the types of things that came out of my brother's mouth at this point was, it should have been me that died, I'm sorry it wasn't me. Lots of those. And in that moment, I wanted to slap him in the face, obviously. But it was interesting to watch Mum and Dad's reaction to that. Because what happened was I was expecting Mum and Dad to step in and say, that's enough, stop it, cut it. They didn't, because they'd been reading a lot and had thought a lot about what was happening at that point in time for Josh, and they just let it happen. In retrospect, that was the best thing they could have done, because from that point on, he was much more open, he was much more able to share what he was feeling. And what that highlighted for me was the differences in our approach to trying to make sense of the chaos. At this point in time, what was really important was the importance of the people who aren't your parents but that you can talk to as an adult. So for me, fortunately enough, they will be my mother and father-in-law in about 6 months' time. Back then I didn't know that. I used to go to their house and I would sit and I would cry and cry and cry and cry, and would listen to Nick's CD, all those things that I couldn't do at home, but I could do it there. And as a sibling, that was really important, to have the adult guidance or the adult comfort without it being your parents, because it was a little bit too raw and too close. So I just wanted to raise that as, it's not that we don't want to do it at home, it's that we have to do it somewhere else for us. I know I'm preaching to the converted in saying this, but I just want to talk about me. I don't want to talk about your grandmother's death. I don't want to hear about your dog. I don't want to hear about your cousin's friend. I don't want to hear what you're feeling. I just want to talk. And that was definitely my frame of reference. I found it really difficult to find the understanding other, as Mel and Di referred to it, was someone who was willing to just sit. And that was part of, and the importance of the process of having those two family friends that I could do that with. The different roles going through that process. As I mentioned, I was sad sister, I was sister to Josh, I was support to Mum, I was support to Dad, I was an 18-year-old that had no idea where I was headed, and then I was just Carly. And I guess part of this process has been around trying to reformulate who you are when what you've been through is such a big part of who you are. And I'll come back to that. But the question of who am I was really quite difficult. At times it was just needing some distance from all of those roles, and sometimes even from myself. So needing the distance from life, which was really important and really quite healing. So small patches of living and breathing at 100 miles an hour, and I came home to Parks and Mum and Dad were here, and I would live and breathe it, and then I would go back to Canberra and I would be blissfully unaware that those emotions were sitting there for me for 2 weeks. And that was really helpful. I would distract myself with netball, with university, with friends, with anything. And I had people say, do you think you're thinking about it enough? Do you think you're really processing it? well, I don't know, you tell me, you seem to be the expert. It was hard to know when to do what. And something that I've observed in this process has been the learning to feel again. And when I look back, my brother and I, and I'm sure bereaved siblings, learn really young what terrible emotions feel like, that sometimes kids don't have to feel until they're much older. And I found, in a way, when I started to feel excited, I was misreading that as sad because it was the same feeling in my belly. Or I remember sort of having a crush on a first boyfriend and was the same feeling in the same area as grief in my heart. And I kept misreading these cues, and that was something, when I look back, is I almost had to retrain myself to feel happy, to feel excited, to feel fulfilled, to feel optimistic, to feel some of those things. And I do think that, given the work that I do, I've probably overanalyzed and psychoanalyzed this a million times. Still don't have any answers for you, sorry, and never will. But that retraining of emotion was really important for me. Using humour was also a big part. I would ring mum and say, yep, I'm having a fruitcake day, don't come and see me. And the ability to actually acknowledge that and sit with that was really important. The starting to put the pieces back together is, I don't know if that's when the numbness wears off, but it really sucks when it does, because it felt like that ton of bricks was coming down on you and your puzzle was back in the air and the pieces were everywhere. So the learning to feel again, the learning to reintegrate felt like what was such a long process, and still is an ongoing process, and always will be an ongoing process. It's just that sometimes the pieces of the puzzle come when you least expect it, sometimes they come in pieces of 10, other times the board is ripped in half again and you have to go and find the outside edge. When I was talking to mum and dad about what do you want me to say, I don't even know where to start, what do I talk through, they said just the stuff that you share with us that we find really useful in understanding what you're going through. So, in taking a step back, part of the process for me of understanding what I was going through was asking as many people as I could get my hands on what their experience was on the day that Nick died. So I drove from here to Falls, I drove from here to Orange, I walked to people's houses, and I just wanted to hear the story. And I believe that that's a really important part of my process, and I am conscious of the fact that that's an ongoing need of mine, is to keep understanding and trying to make sense of it, and to keep analysing where we're at. And when I recently decided to move from Canberra to Mount Isa, which is not a small distance and a long distance from Parkes, I found that there was something odd with mum and dad. I knew they were really excited for me, but I couldn't read what else was going on for them. And I was thinking about this when I was driving along, and I guess I took the step back, which I didn't do as a sibling, because we can be selfish little shits when we're going through this ourselves. We can be incredibly selfish. I tried to take the step back and think, if I was mum and dad, what would I be thinking? And all of a sudden it dawned on me, they're going to go back through the same feelings that they felt when they lost Nick, because they think they're going to lose me. My less mature side was like, oh, they just need to deal with it. Seriously, I'm so excited. And, why can't they just be excited? This is ridiculous. And then when I stopped to think about it, I thought those feelings are almost exactly the same. Are we going to lose another child? So it's still that navigation through what is the unknown at each and every step. And I guess as a sibling, coming back to this point of being quite selfish as we are, you know, I used to get really upset when I'd go to a barbecue or to a party and Mum wouldn't come. I was like, why can't she just come? I really wanted her to come. And then Dad would come and then he'd go a little bit early. And it was all about me. I want you there. I really need you there. And I guess from a sibling perspective, what that has taught me is that we can be incredibly selfish, but it's unintentional. Trying to unpack and understand what's happening for us. And on that journey by ourselves, it can appear quite selfish, but it's unintentional. I talk a little bit to people about what is termed in psychological literature as post-traumatic growth. The definition of it goes something like what this slide says, which refers to the positive psychological change experienced as a result of a struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. These sets of circumstances represent significant challenges to the adaptive resources, etc., etc. Post-traumatic growth is not simply a return to baseline from a period of suffering. Instead, it is the experience of improvement that for some persons is deeply profound. I don't think this is in any way relevant to grief and bereavement. I do, however, want to talk a little bit about the finding meaning and what that meant for me, and I don't want it to appear to be something like this post-traumatic growth and it was for a higher cause and it was for a better reason, because I don't in my heart believe that. However, for me it was and is about finding some sort of meaning in life as it stands now in a way that makes you feel almost whole again, but in a different way. Of course, I would change what I've been through in a heartbeat, but we can't. And people who talk about moving forward and moving on and accepting and all that stuff where your mind just thinks, yeah, right. I don't try and accept that Nick's gone. I know he is. But I accept that because he's gone, I'm going to feel like crap occasionally. And that's okay. So trying to make room for some of those tears and some of that sadness and accepting that that is part of this process. And I think that's where sometimes we can get caught up in this, you need to get better, you need to move on, you need to look forward. Agreed, but we can't. At times it's really difficult, and I think as siblings, you feel like you have to, and you feel like you want to, but you don't know how. And it's finding the how skills that was really quite difficult. One of the more pronounced themes for me throughout the journey, and as I continue on the journey, is who am I now? Irrespective of what we've been through and how much losing Nick has defined our life. And who am I now outside of that? And I am 10 years down the track. I still don't know the answer, but I think I'm closer to it. I'm not just, oh, that's Nick Fisher's sister. That's that one over there, you know, that's Nick Fisher's sister. It's actually, I need to do things to create Carly Fisher again. And feeling like we've made some choices. I've made some choices along the line that's helped with that, but I think it's an ongoing process. Nick will always be there and be a big part of who I am and who my brother is and all of those types of things. But I know for Mum and Dad perhaps it will define them in more of a way than what it would define my brother and I. And I talk about this in a sense that, to give you an example, in April next year I'm getting married. So all of a sudden it throws up all this right, is this going to be a Nick show or is this going to be a Carly show? And what are we going to do about finding a balance? Because Nick has always been a big part of our life and always will be, but this is my day. And to be the selfish little shit that we can be occasionally, that's important for me. And the next chapter is, okay, this is that next step. But it's also about acknowledging that Nick's not there, because it's one of those times that we all have on a number of occasions where it's like, yeah, I know I have to do this, but there's a big piece missing. And I found a quote the other day which I thought was quite fitting. It may have come from Facebook, but I still feel it had some relevance. Missing someone isn't about how long it's been since you've seen them or the amount of time since you've talked. It's about the very moment when you're doing something and you wish that they were right there. And quite honestly, I don't think that will ever change, even for siblings. But, and I say a but, I think that it becomes less toxic and less potent and less right in your face for us than perhaps it does for bereaved parents. I know that Mum and Dad will probably think about Nick a lot more on my wedding day than I will, but he'll still be there. So it's a different experience, but he's still there. Something that is really important for me is my relationship and my ongoing relationship with Nick. And I will talk a little bit about that, but even now I can be driving along and I think, come on Nick, just help Mum and Dad to get through the wedding day. You can do it. Then, but you're the little shit that caused this. And I think that there's this internal dialogue for me personally that's really important for that ongoing relationship with Nick. And I'll come back to that, but the other thing for me, 26 years old, getting married, going down that path as you do, I am frightened to death of having my own kids. And the reason I say that is because I'll then know or begin to understand what a bond is between a mother and child. Not what it feels like to be a bereaved parent, but I'll understand the bond. And I reckon my puzzle is likely to be thrown back in the air and I'm going to have to start putting those pieces back together. And that's okay. That's the cards we've been dealt with, but it's really going to hurt again. And that's part of the journey and part of the puzzle. Just a few words on kids. I've never ever been more amazed at the resilience of kids. I look at myself and I look at my brother and I look at lots of other people I work with, children, not necessarily bereaved siblings, but just children in general, and they're incredibly resilient in finding their way somehow, and also incredibly switched on with what's going on, as you would know. To give you an example, I recently lost my puppy, and I have a niece who is 3 and another niece who is 2, and I heard them chatting over near where we buried Neville. And I wandered over and I said, what are you talking about? And Macy proceeds to say, well, Auntie Carly, me just telling Lily that Puggy in heaven with Nick and now he's Nick's dog, not yours. Cool, sounds good. At least he's got someone looking after him. And I guess for me that was one of those moments where neither Macy nor Lily were part of Nick's life, nor were they even close to being alive. And nor were they really that close with our family when Nick died, but purely because of the way that my sister-in-law has spoken to them, and they come over on the 28th of December and I'm drinking wine and we have celebration drinks and we talk about Nick, and they have no idea what's going on, but they know something's a bit different. So Brooke will sit down with them and talk them through, so Nick died and this is what this means, and so they understand it. It's become part of their vocabulary. I had a difficult client one day. I was having stressed day, ended up at my sister-in-law's house in tears. Carly's Nick back. Every association that they've now made when I'm upset is Nick back. And I guess I think it's priceless and gorgeous, and I could never ever be offended or hurt by what they say. But what it shows is that they actually will conceptualise and get things even at 2 and 3. And they, 10 years down the track from Nick dying, still know what Nick was like and the type of person that he was, and I hope that my children are the same. I will talk about their Uncle Nick quite openly, and I'm sure if I didn't, Mum and Dad would. But it's important that's an important process for me and for my partner. It was really interesting going through my training because they took me to the depths of darkness I didn't want to go to, but I knew was important to do what I do. I had a supervisor say to me one day, Carly, at your 90th birthday party, what is it you want people to say about you and the way that you lived your life? I thought, that is a really odd question. Where do I go with that? And I sat back and I really thought, I think I'd want them to say that I was fun-loving, I was energetic, I was kind-hearted and compassionate, I was tough-minded, resilient, sometimes stubborn, but I was quite generous and caring. And I worked a lot with my supervisor around, you can't change the grief, but you can know it's there and do things that are really important for who you want to be going forward. I know that there would be people here that would be thinking, yep, that's way easier said than done. And I still think that myself as well. But channeling some energy into the places where I get some sense of relief has been really important for me as a sibling. The ongoing relationship with Nick, and I would suggest that this has been probably one of the most fundamental and critical parts of the process for me, is I still, when I'm driving down the street and I go past a red hot V8, wind the window down and think, yeah, give it some, because I think that's exactly what Nick would do. I can be driving to work in the morning, quite tired, thinking, I wonder what today is going to bring, and next minute the song comes on the radio. And I'm like, Nick, not today, go away. I was saying to Dad that yesterday I was working in Canberra doing some coaching, and I was preparing for my sessions the day after, and I was watching a bit of Law and Order, and sure enough, the 15-year-old boy that had passed away in the show's name was Nicholas. Same hair colour, same build. It hadn't registered, but I got to my 2:30 till 5 o'clock coaching session and his name was Nick. And I was like, you just can't leave me alone this weekend, can you? It's an interesting dichotomy from what I can try and wrap my head around in terms of, I know that he's gone, I know that. I've come to the terms that he's not here, but part of the grief journey and the puzzle for me is still having a relationship with him, which is really important. And, you know, I think Mal alluded to this, some people think you're really crazy when you say things like, come on Nick, I just really need a car park, so I'm running about 15 minutes late here, give me something to work with. I had girlfriends that would look at me and go, she lost the plot? What's going on? And it's the forgetting that you are different. And so it's not just feeling different, you are different. And that's okay. And in terms of the relationships and in terms of that social support, I had friends that I thought would be there till the end of the time and they weren't. Quite quickly gave them the flick. They had friends that came out of the woodwork. And I even had one friend say to me, Carly, I used to think, please don't sit me beside Carly Fisher because she's going to cry. Well, that was actually a fact, but she was quite interesting because she would just call it as it is. So it was amazing that someone at the age of 17 could say, "You having an egg day today?" "Yep, do not look me in the eye, do not ask me how I'm feeling because I'm about to burst into tears." And she'd just walk with me. Then there was other friends who would, I'm sure, come up to mum and dad's just so they could go and feed back to their friends how Carly Fish is going. And that was quite difficult to try and manoeuvre through, and those pieces of the puzzle, I'm still unsure of where they fit. But I guess I have an internal belief that everyone makes the best decision that they can at that point in time with the resources available. So they didn't know what to do at that point in time. They might now. I've also had people come back to me and say, "I was really nasty to you." Yeah, you were. But trying to let some of that go, which has been quite difficult, because I could hate you and actually blame you for some of what I was feeling, but I can't. And I guess what I've come to realise as a sibling, as a practitioner first, the models don't hold and they never will. I am guided more by my intuitive judgment when I'm working with bereaved families and siblings than I am by the Kubler-Ross stages of grief and all those things that people hand you when you're an intern that you think in your mind, "I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to adopt this, but I'm not going to because it doesn't fit." And if I do nothing else with the families and the siblings I work for, if I can normalise it and validate it, it's one of the most powerful experiences I think you can have. And I guess that's what the Compassionate Friends for me and what I understood of it prior to coming my first time this weekend is just the normalisation of I'm not a freak and I'm not different and I'm not weird, and I think that's really important. And in terms of the way I like to work with myself is if I can be kind to myself and not try and belt myself up over things, but also be kind to other people, it gives something to hold on to. In so much as I would like to walk away from this and say, well, life punched me in the face, so I punched it back. And that, I think, speaks to the resilience of kids to an extent. There were points where my brother and I could have gone to the complete other end of the spectrum, and we probably did, drank way too much, made some really poor decisions. But that was where we tried the different part of the river from Mal's picture and it didn't quite work, so we got back into the other part. And for me and going forward, it's about accepting the unknown and that's all right. And actually having the patience with whatever comes up, and whatever I'm going to experience, I'm going to experience whether I like it or not. So, as I've mentioned at the bottom of this slide, it's okay, each day is what it is. Let's just roll with that. Thank you.
Hopefully we know a little bit more about our children, from what you've just said, Carly. And I know for Judy myself, it's just a positive thing. And yeah, just for Carly too, probably for Judy myself to validate how it would be. That's just how it is. And I think it's time for a break now. Thank you.